Donald Trump has imposed a trade agreement on Europe in which the EU commits to purchasing LNG, oil and chips worth $750 billion without a symmetrical purchasing commitment from the USA. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping watches with undisguised satisfaction as his government-subsidized conglomerates eliminate European competition from batteries through wind turbines to cars. Even Qatar, a tiny desert country, showed Europe that one warning letter is enough to make Brussels start backing down from its principles. Once the British Empire would have sent an entire fleet of gunboats from Portsmouth to force a stubborn emir into concessions. Now one can only show submission. What happened to Europe, which once dictated terms to the entire world? How is it possible that the Green Deal, a project created by an army of 32,000 Brussels bureaucrats that was supposed to make the Union a leader of the 21st century, has become an instrument of its economic oppression? To such an extent that residents of Wolfsburg, one of Europe's richest cities and the heart of its key industrial champion, suddenly fear for their future and are putting their houses up for sale en masse. How Europe is becoming a colonial market for superpowers. Europe's transformation from a global hegemon into a quasi-colonial market is accelerating at an alarming pace. Trump is forcing purchases worth $750 billion. Chinese corporations are wiping out European competition, and even tiny Qatar is dictating terms to Brussels. Having analyzed these processes for years, I know how important it is to have the tools to actively respond to the changes taking place. That is why I work with XTB, an investment app that is my financial management center. If you follow global trends, you can see how the centers of economic power are shifting. With XTB, you can use your knowledge to invest in thousands of stocks and ETFs with no commission up to 100,000 euros of monthly turnover. Do you believe in the future of American LNG? Or maybe Chinese batteries? You can take advantage of any such trend with XTB. Check out XTB in the description. By doing so, you support this channel. Remember that investing involves risk. Among the many buckets of cold water that have recently fallen on the European Union, the one from Qatar is exceptionally icy. This small but influential state has expressed opposition to the EU's CSDDD directive, one of the pillars of the Green Deal, meant to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. What's this about? CSDDD, or Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, imposes on large companies the obligation to monitor their own activities and those of their partners in terms of emissions, environmental impact, and human rights compliance. This meant detailed documentation and extensive reporting. After protests, the European Commission limited the directive's scope. From July 2027, it will only cover EU companies employing over 1,000 people and achieving turnover above 350 million euros. Smaller enterprises will avoid costs that across the entire Union would reach 6.4 billion euros annually. Estimated costs for covered companies are 220 million euros for implementation and 760 million euros annually. Still quite a lot, considering the need to create an entire reporting department. It was reasonably assumed that since EU companies bear costs and meet new obligations, their foreign partners should too. Otherwise, the latter would have a competitive advantage. Therefore, all companies from outside the EU that sell goods or services in its territory will be covered by CSDDD if their EU turnover exceeds 1.5 billion euros in 2027. From 2029, the threshold will drop to 450 million euros. This condition will be met by, among others, Qatar Energy, controlled by Emir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, which achieved $27.9 billion in net profit in 2023. For such a giant, reporting costs shouldn't pose a problem. However, here Brussels officials were in for a big surprise. In a letter to the European Commission from May 2025, Qatari Energy Minister Saad Al-Kaabi made the matter clear. If the EU doesn't exempt Qatari companies from the CSDDD directive, Qatar will, quote, seriously consider redirecting LNG exports and other products to more stable and friendly markets. This position, though couched in diplomatic tone, certainly originated from the initiative of Emir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. Although Qatar is a country the size of Luxembourg, it is the world's third largest LNG exporter, after the USA and Australia, and today satisfies 12 to 14% of EU demand for this resource. Unluckily for the Union, Emir Al Thani has apparently taken to heart President Theodore Roosevelt's motto: speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far. He is therefore polite to Brussels, but doesn't hide that the energy stick he wields is very thick. In the mid-19th century, if any emir had similarly threatened the British Empire, gunboats would have quickly appeared off his country's coast and shelled his palace until he changed his mind. Today, the European Commission, knowing what a Qatari embargo on LNG deliveries would mean, responded that, quote, among other things, simplification of regulations and postponement of the regulations' entry into force to mid-2028 is planned, unquote. The emir politely acknowledged the information but didn't put down his stick. The incident with Qatar is a small prelude to what awaits the European Union and its Green Deal. Creating its assumptions was based on a flawed foundation. It assumed that thanks to the economic strength of member countries and the great attractiveness of the common market, the EU would be able to impose its rules on countries and companies seeking economic cooperation, so that over time they would adapt the European Green Deal rules as their own, while bearing similar costs. Meanwhile, tiny Qatar has shown that it's enough to have a big stick, and the EU becomes helpless. It doesn't possess a sufficiently threatening tool to enforce compliance with its own rules. After decades of neglect, its military potential proves to be modest at best. The community's capacity for decisive action is virtually non-existent. Its economic strength is also becoming less and less impressive. If this is what happens when EU interests clash with those of one emirate, what can we expect when there is a prolonged clash with China and the United States? After all, the leaders of these superpowers have a wide range of powerful tools at their disposal and are not willing to let their countries' economies bear the costs of the European Green Deal, especially when they can make pure profits from it. One of the main characteristics of a large bureaucratic structures is inertia. When such a structure is tasked with implementing complicated undertakings and bureaucratic activities, such as developing successive directives, regulations and guidelines, it becomes very difficult to change anything. With a workforce of over 32,000 officials, the European Commission has created one of the largest and most advanced bureaucratic apparatuses in human history. At the end of 2019, this apparatus was tasked with implementing the Green Deal concept within the Union. It is intended to help transform the EU into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy that will achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, mandates the strategy developed by the European Commission. The main tools of this transformation are EU directives. Although they are assessed, as in Mario Draghi's report, for example, the system struggles with its own inertia. The larger the bureaucratic apparatus and the more perfect the regulations it produces, the stronger it becomes, and the harder it is to make radical changes to the chosen course. Proof? In July 2025, the European Commission presented a draft amendment to the climate law. This assumes that by 2040, member states will have reduced CO2 emissions by 90% compared to 1990 levels. This new move by the Commission is the result of a growing conviction that the target of reducing emissions by 55% by 2030, enshrined in the EU climate law, will not be met. According to forecasts by the European Environment Agency, the decline will be closer to 43%. That's a difference of 12 percentage points. In response, the bureaucratic machine has decided to accelerate in the hope that, over time, the statistics will add up, and climate neutrality will actually be achieved by 2050. In a communication dated 2nd of July 2025, the Commission assured that the new plan builds on existing targets but assumes more pragmatic and flexible methods of achieving them. What does this mean in practice? Just in case a Plan B has been provided, from 2036, EU countries will be able to finance climate projects outside the Union, or buy emission rights instead of reducing emissions at home. This will lead to the expansion of the global carbon credit market. In practice, this means that EU states would pay for the right to emit CO2 to countries where industry, energy or automotive sectors barely exist, mainly African states. Although this is still only a draft, it can be assumed that the EU bureaucratic machine, driven by inertia, will strive to implement it. We therefore have a large bureaucratic apparatus incapable of rapid response or flexible action, and reprogramming it to implement a completely new strategy requires years of consensus in the European Council. Extremely difficult to achieve due to numerous conflicting interests. So since rapid reprogramming of EU bureaucracy is unrealistic, the only option is to fight inertia by correcting the Green Deal, so that the great transformation ends in success, not catastrophe. In its communication of 2nd July 2025, the Commission announced that the new proposal is consistent with the EU Competitiveness Compass, the Clean Industry Deal, and the Affordable Energy Action Plan. This is no coincidence. It is intended to demonstrate that the Commission is in control and is supporting industry, competitiveness, and decarbonization. Officially, everything is under control. However, it would be wise to express concern now, before it's too late, not only to save the Green Deal, but also the Union itself. The European Green Deal measures success exclusively through the prism of CO2 emission reductions. All actions have been subordinated to this overriding principle, not so much a goal as an idea defining the entire strategy. Meanwhile, the EU's global rivals, like the USA and China, are guided by a much simpler indicator: the number of successes, economic and political. As long as the United States promoted a similar transformation, competition was relatively equal. But after Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 election, everything changed. We will not sabotage our own industry while China pollutes the environment, Trump declared, launching an offensive. In January 2025, he withdrew the US from the Paris agreements, abandoning the CO2 emission targets set by the Biden administration. Over the following months, he eliminated subsidies for green industries, beginning with electric cars. Then, in July, he signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, abolishing subsidies for wind and solar energy. A few days later, EPA Chief Lee Zeldin announced that climate change no longer posed a threat to public health. This undermined the legal basis for emission restrictions, announcing the end of regulations that harm consumers and industry. Only time will tell whether Trump will succeed, but his actions are already a blow to the European Union. Within a few months, the United States had rejected all the Green Deal principles that the EU had bound its own economy to. However, Washington didn't stop there. Trump brandished the Rooseveltian big stick and began threatening Brussels bureaucrats. The stick in question was tariffs. Donald Trump conducted the negotiations in his usual manner, repeatedly announcing tariff increases of at least 30%, with some goods subject to even higher tariffs. Ultimately, the preliminary agreement resulted in a basic tariff of 15% on both sides, as well as the determination of export quotas for steel, aluminum and copper products. Some goods, including aircraft parts and equipment, certain chemicals, generic drugs, semiconductor production equipment, and specific critical raw materials were exempted from tariffs on both sides. The agreement, conducted on 27th of July 2025, by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and President Donald Trump also includes significant benefits for the USA. According to the European Commission website, the Union has committed to purchasing a quota of liquefied natural gas (LNG), crude oil, and nuclear energy products worth $750 billion from American suppliers over 3 years, which will, quote, contribute to replacing Russian gas and oil in the EU market. Additionally, the EU has pledged to purchase chips worth 40 billion euros. The European Commission also promised, quote, promoting and facilitating mutual investments on both sides of the Atlantic. EU enterprises have expressed interest in investing at least $600 billion in various sectors in the USA by 2029. In summary, before the agreement was concluded, the EU's basic tariff rate on goods from key US industries was 10%. In the US, it was 2.5%. Now it is 0% on American goods and 15% on EU goods, respectively. Additionally, there were no commitments regarding fuel purchases or investments. Currently, alongside the removal of restrictions and costs related to the Green Deal, US economic entities are set to benefit from EU tariffs no longer being 4 times higher than American ones. Add to this the fact that about $1 trillion of capital will flow from Europe to the United States through liquid fuel purchases and investments. This will make American companies even more efficient at penetrating the still prosperous European market. This can only be described as a tributary act, whereby the stronger party, with its arsenal of sticks, dictates terms to the weaker side. Donald Trump loves putting on spectacular shows, while Chinese President Xi Jinping seems to embody Chancellor Angela Merkel's favorite saying. According to her biographers, it was, "The weak make a lot of noise, while true strength moves on tiptoes." However, this doesn't mean he rejects the idea of combining politeness with a strong stance. At the China-EU summit on July 25, 2025, Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa urged Xi Jinping to present an ambitious emissions reduction plan by 2035 and to join the global methane commitment. However, Xi Jinping ignored these appeals and instead called for markets to be opened up and restrictions on Chinese companies to be halted. As he stated, competitiveness is not about building walls and barriers. Breaking supply chains leads to isolation. This dialogue best reflects mutual concerns. For years, the EU, especially Germany and the European Commission, harbored hopes that Beijing would eventually adapt European rules. Although Xi never declared this directly, he skillfully gave hope. China joined the Paris Agreement, and Xi announced climate neutrality by 2060, right after the EU. However, he stipulated that China would increase emissions until 2030, and only then begin reducing them. Over the past decade, China has invested considerable resources in wind and solar energy, introducing a CO2 emissions trading system similar to the EU's ETS, with one key difference. It has full control over permit prices. While a ton of CO2 cost as much as €100 in the EU in 2023, in China it cost just $14, later falling below $10. China acted similarly in other areas of green transformation, minimizing its own costs and using European initiatives to generate profit. This way effectively supported its own companies, which became global leaders in the production of batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, and electric cars, often at the expense of EU competitors whom they drove into bankruptcy. Such actions strengthened China's position as the world's factory with growth based on exports. In 2024, the EU's trade deficit with China reached a high of €305 billion. Overproduction in Chinese factories only deepens the need for further export expansion. It is no coincidence that in 2024, the Joe Biden administration imposed tariffs of over 100% on Chinese electric cars, and the EU followed suit, albeit more cautiously, introducing variable tariffs of up to 30%. Meanwhile, overproduction of goods by China is threatening the internal stability of domestic economies worldwide, with over 50 countries, including EU countries, introducing tariffs to limit exports from China. Beijing, however, shows no panic. For a decade, it has systematically diversified its exports in order to avoid dependence on the EU and the USA. Still, during the Beijing summit, Xi Jinping revealed his greatest fear: that Europe will follow Trump's lead. It is true that after initiating the trade war, Trump has temporarily lowered tariffs on China from 145% to 30%, a move to which Beijing has responded by reducing tariffs from 125% to 10%. Nevertheless, according to a forecast by the Observatory of Economic Complexity, Chinese export to the US could fall by $485 billion by 2027. While this would not cause the Chinese economy to collapse, it would certainly damage it significantly and encourage Beijing to pursue an even more aggressive expansion strategy. While the EU is the wealthiest and most vulnerable market, and Xi also has his big sticks and is willing to brandish them at Europe. On the 4th of June 2025, the European Commission approved 13 projects aimed at ensuring access to strategic raw materials from outside the EU. 10 of these projects focus on lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese and graphite, which are crucial for the production of electric cars and batteries. The remaining projects focus on rare earth elements. However, these actions appear to be at least 6 years too late. Without these raw materials, implementing the Green Deal is impossible. And without rare earth metals, it is impossible to produce anything today, from smartphones to drones to fighter jets. According to 2024 Eurostat data, meanwhile, 46% of rare earth metals imported to the EU come from China, 26% from Russia, and 20% from Malaysia. Furthermore, as much as 90% of the global refining of these metals takes place in China. Beijing also supplies 38% of graphite, 96% of magnesium, and 73% of gallium, raw materials that are essential for industry. China could therefore paralyze production in Europe by simply imposing an embargo. In fact, they have used this very tool against the USA. And a few weeks later, Donald Trump withdrew tariffs of 145%, lowering them to 30%, and sought a compromise with Beijing. The European Union has an even poorer, critical raw material base than the USA, and its only defense against Chinese blackmail is tariffs. However, Beijing does not want a trade war. It is sufficient for them to earn from the European Green Deal without obstacles as a key supplier of products and technologies, with no tariffs. The benefits that were supposed to go to European companies now go to China. The costs of transformation are being borne by European societies and enterprises without any economic compensation. This enables Chinese conglomerates to finance expansion into further sectors, which the European automotive industry is experiencing firsthand today. 2024 was a disastrous year for German brands, which lost even more market share in China. In July 2025, Volkswagen announced the closure of its 360 car per year factory in Nanjing. EU companies are losing the price war with government-subsidized Chinese producers, whose cars, especially electric ones, often outclass European electric vehicles. But this is just the beginning. Facing overproduction, Chinese conglomerates are transferring this war to EU markets, displacing local players. Meanwhile, the automotive sector is the foundation of the EU economy. It provides about 13 million jobs and generates about 1 trillion euros in GDP annually, which constitutes a significant part of the EU's 17 trillion GDP. The collapse of the automotive industry in Europe would have catastrophic consequences, and ordinary people are beginning to realize this. As early as October 2024, Deutsche Welle reported on a grim atmosphere in Wolfsburg, one of Germany's wealthiest cities, where nearly half the population is employed by Volkswagen. People are fearful for their future. Some are even considering selling their homes before they lose value. Almost no one wants to talk or be photographed, reported the Deutsche Welle journalist. This fear is justified, especially when viewed more broadly. Both the United States and China have rejected the economic rules promoted by the European Commission. They are not abandoning energy transformation, but are only developing it where it brings benefits, without bearing the costs of the Green Deal. What will the result be? CO2 emissions in the USA are falling anyway, albeit without ideological fanaticism. Interestingly, China also recorded a drop in CO2 emissions for the first time since the pandemic in 2024. Both superpowers, the USA and China, have made it clear that they will only cooperate with the European Union on their own terms. Beijing and Washington are arranging their relations with Brussels in order to maximize the profits of their own companies. They are treating the EU like 19th century powers treated their colonies, as a market for their goods, a colonial market. This analogy particularly well captures China's situation, as it has begun to face an overproduction crisis, much like the British Empire once did. The Middle Kingdom must therefore export more and more products to escape it. This ensures the livelihood of domestic producers and provides the country with stability and development. The worst news for the EU is that both Donald Trump and Xi Jinping have sufficient leverage to force the bloc into submission. The EU itself is unable to develop a unified and effective resistance strategy due to differences in national interests, which other major powers skillfully exploit. Yet despite the changing reality, Brussels is clinging desperately to the Green Deal and its sacred indicator of CO2 emissions. It is introducing further taxes, such as ETS2 and restrictions, while counting on CBAM carbon tariffs and the Mercosur agreement as a shield against cheaper competition from countries such as China, the USA and India. However, no one explains why these countries wouldn't simply force changes, as Qatar has done with the CSDDD. Nor is there any explanation as to why European companies should succeed in new markets when they are already failing in their own. Therefore, in the coming years, we may witness an increasingly tightening noose around EU economies. Declining incomes and raising living costs, driven by Green Deal principles, will provide political fuel for populist groups, with Germany's Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, France's National Rally, or Poland's Confederation at the forefront. These groups share one thing: opposition to Brussels bureaucracy and a desire to reconstruct the Union, or even leave it altogether, as Britain did. And so, contrasting the strategies of the USA and China, and considering their potential impact on the internal politics of member states, one can envisage an end to the Green Deal. Weakened by Chinese expansion and American protectionism, Europe will find it increasingly difficult to bear the burden of a transformation that leaves it more vulnerable and costly. In the best-case scenario, the European Commission will gradually dismantle the Green Deal through successive corrections and the abandonment of its most costly elements. In the worst-case scenario, everything will collapse under the weight of crisis and rebellion by successive states. Not only would climate policy be threatened, but the very future of the European Union as a whole. If the European Union is unable to fulfill its two core functions of protecting the common market and its producers, as well as maintaining the free movement of people and goods within the community, we talked about it in the Schengen episode, then something fundamental is clearly not working. This translates into a failure to fulfill the Union's main promise of improving the prosperity and security of its citizens. This is a very loud warning bell, perhaps even one of the last, for what is arguably the best transnational political project in European history.